All right, good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you once again to our weekly California Housing and Community Development Office Hours Brown Bag session. We are looking forward to discussing some HMIS and HDIS information with you today, and as it pertains to equity and other important matters. Next slide, please. So for this session today, let's just review how to ask a question. We welcome your questions, and to ask a question, we would ask that you submit your question in the chat box, type your organization as well as the question into the chat, and the team will read the questions out loud at the end of the presentation and provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. Please know you have a team of people in the background that are researching answers. So if we aren't able to get to your question because we need more information in order to answer it, we will be answering those after the session. All questions and answers entered into the chat box are going to be recorded as part of the public record, as is this session. Next slide, please. For our agenda today, we will start with some announcements. Then we'll have ESG and ESG CV updates. We will have an office hours update, ESG CV Q&A, and then a brown bag session for racial equity and data. Please note that we will be sending out the copy of the presentation after this session. So in case you're wondering that, you will be receiving this afterward. Next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Connie now for some ESG updates.
Good morning. So 2022 ESG NOFN applications, we plan to release those the end of May. For those that submitted 2021 ESG applications, I've had this slide up here for a while. It's currently with our director and for final approval, and then we will be making award announcements probably the end of this month or the first part of April. And then of course the award list will be posted to our website. Just a reminder, those with 2021 or 2020 ESG annual contracts, the expenditure deadline is July 7th, so not very far away. Please spend the money. If you're struggling, please reach out to us as soon as possible, and we'd be happy to meet with you on a Teams call and see if there's anything we can do. That's a budget revision, but please don't wait till before the July 7th deadline if you're struggling to expend your 2020 contract. Next slide, please. I wanted to remind our grantees that our ESG team sent out a couple weeks ago an email to all those that had 2018, 19, and current 2020 ESG annual contracts to complete a spreadsheet and a COVID waiver template. If you applied any COVID waivers towards your ESG annual contracts for 18, 19, or 20, we do need you to complete that spreadsheet. Even if you didn't, please complete that Excel spreadsheet that was sent, and you can just put zeros in there. The HUD requires that the state track all annual ESG funds that were used for COVID separately, and so we do need that information. If you could just give that back to us. If you emails were sent out, if you are not sure what I'm talking about, please reach out to your ESG rep as soon as possible, and we will get that out to you. Maybe the email, if the email was missed, but we do need that information back because it is, HUD does require that we track that again. For those of you with annual contracts or that had 18 and 19 annual contracts, if you used and applied any of the COVID waivers to your annual contract, we just need to know the amount, whether that's even if that's a zero. So if you're not sure again what I'm talking about, if you haven't seen the email, please reach out to us. You can always contact the ESG NOFA inbox too. Next slide, please. And again, this is our ESG. These are our ESG team members. and that is our ESG NOFA box email address. You can always reach us there. We monitor that inbox throughout the day. And that is all I have today. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. And in terms of ESG-CV reminders and updates, please continue to work towards submitting your February RFF and budget amendments for cleanup in indirect costs and e-civis. It is important that we get those budget amendments from you. If you are going to be requesting reimbursement for indirects in the future, we'll have our partner MDG reviewing your budget amendments over the course of the next week or two. So time is of the essence to get those in so that you'll be ready to submit your next RFF after that takes place. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of a couple of updates, we have a new training site that you can now go to see all of the trainings that are going to be coming up. At this point, I think we have trainings that are through August, with more being added all the time. You can also register from that site. And in terms of upcoming office hours, next week we'll be talking about engagement with DV providers. Then we'll be talking about the equal access rule. And on the 13th of April, authentic engagement of persons with lived experience. Next slide, please. And on this page, we have got a list of COVID response resources that we hope will be useful to you. As we will be sending the slide deck after this presentation, you'll be able to link to any of these from the links that are in the deck. Next slide, please. And ESG resources and links. Here is another good list of resources that will soon be headed your way. And we encourage you to make use of the good information that you can find here. Next slide, please. All right, any questions? I'm not seeing so far any questions in the chat, but let me go ahead and take a quick pause to see if anyone would like to pose a question. Okay, it looks like we've got a question that has come up. I see in the chat from Alex Chavez. For rapid rehousing under ESG-CV, can funds be used to pay months in advance for a participant's rent? Example, pay for up to 3 months of rent. And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. You can use landlord incentives that could potentially cover some items, extra security, things like that, but we're not looking at it covering rent. We do have the EHBs that would be useful for that, but that, of course, is not through ESG or ESG-CV. Is there anyone else that either wants to respond to that question, or are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing that. Give it just one more second. Okay, let me go ahead then, and we'll please keep in mind that we welcome your questions, and we will always have the ability to answer questions at the end of the session or during the next portion of the presentation. But let me go ahead and turn it over now. Mindy, Mindy Mitchell is here. Would you like to go ahead and lead us into our next segment, as well as Chris? I see you up there. If you wouldn't mind taking it from here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Next slide, Taylor. Thank you, Kristen. We are going to pivot. You can still ask your ESG and ESG-CV questions in the chat, and the folks will respond to those from the grant administration team or the HCD ESG annual team. But now we're going to switch over to our brown bag presentation today. And as Kristen mentioned, I get the pleasure of spending time once again with Mindy Mitchell from Homebase. And we are today going to talk about racial equity in data. So we have done a full session on this. We wanted to do a more condensed version and get some information in front of you. And then obviously during the brown bag sessions, we want you to communicate. We want you to come off mute and talk. We want you to raise your hand. We'll let you go. We want you to say something in the chat. We'll react to it. This is your time to interact with us on this particular topic. We know that a lot of folks during the pandemic specifically have begun to really think about racial equity, and data is a really good first step. It is by no means the last step. It is the first step for many of us to have these conversations. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that, what that looks like. And then I'm specifically going to get into a couple of California specific data sets that we have at our disposal to look at racial equity data. So without any further ado, I'm going to first hand it to Mindy to walk us through the first few slides, and I'll come back and talk about California specific data. Mindy?
Chris. Hey, everybody. Good to see you all again here on office hours. You can go to the next slide. A thing that I really like about doing these office hours is there's hopefully, ideally, a very little presentation from us and a lot more discussion with you guys. And when it comes to thinking about disparities and data, I just wanted to give us a little grounding kind of in making sure that we acknowledge, first of all, there's no perfect data, but we have to start somewhere. So you use the data that you have, and you can't, what's the saying, not letting perfection be the enemy of the good, right? So we're never going to have perfect data ever, like ever. It's never going to be perfect, but we can start somewhere and then we can keep getting better. We always have to look at data with a critical eye, being aware that if we have issues on data quality, and there are tons of resources about improving data quality that you guys can access through HUD and through HCD, but just when you're thinking about data quality and you're analyzing your data and asking these critical questions about the data, keep in mind that the fact that you don't have good quality data may also be keeping some of the information that you need to know about disparities and inequities. So part of the using good practices on our data and doing it from an equity lens is always looking at the quality of our data and acknowledging where it's not good and where it can get better, but never stopping and letting any of that stop you from moving forward. One of the things that I really love about science, and I think a lot of people don't, we always talk about science says, but the thing about science is there's just a lot of uncertainty in science. There's never 100% certainty. So you're always questioning things, including your own assumptions. You're using the data to question that, but then you're also questioning the data. So there's this really like constant feedback loop of looking at what we know, what we think we know, what do we really know. I especially like using our data to debunk our assumptions. I think a really important thing that happens with the data that I love best about data is for a long time, we came into the work with people experiencing homelessness from a really paternalistic place about what we think homeless people need, and that's really rooted in a they're broken and need to be fixed kind of mindset. And the data itself is part of what helped to push back against that. There's also just a like morally wrong thing, but those morals are arguable, right? But the data clearly indicated that that approach doesn't work for most people experiencing homelessness if what we're talking about working is actually ending homelessness, right? But that's what this final point is about here too, is we're not just talking about numbers. We're thinking about the context within which those numbers are found. This is, if you guys think back to when we talked about racial equity and coordinated entry, kind of that flow chart, right? You're always thinking about like, there's multiple questions that you should be asking of the data itself, of where the data came from, of who's gathering the data, right? Of where the data is being gathered, what questions you're asking, how they're being asked. All of that matters when we're thinking about how to get good quality data and thinking about what the data actually tells us. But again, starting here is just to say this can feel like a lot, but don't let it stop you, because you have to start somewhere. You have to get a baseline, and then you go from there and build out. Next slide. So these are just pretty simple, like what data do you need to get started? You're looking at the data in your homelessness system, both your point in time count, your annual data, looking at your census data, your poverty rates, like all of that matters when you're thinking about whether or not you have disparities among people experiencing homelessness, right? Who's coming into the system, who is overrepresented and underrepresented. Then you're looking at who's being served by the homelessness system itself. This is where that annualized data is really important. Also looking at the data on your coordinated entry list. Who's not being served is also always a really important question to ask. How is it matching up to who's experiencing poverty in your community and who's experiencing homelessness in your community? And then finally, how is the system itself serving people experiencing homelessness? And this is where you're looking at some of your system performance measures by demographics, right? To see whether or not you have variable performance based on race. As you guys heard me talk about last time, even in communities where there's not disparities getting into the homelessness system, very often one of the system performance measures where it's pretty consistent across communities where there is a disparity is among returns to homelessness. And when we talk about questioning the data and like using the data as a jumping off point to have a conversation, that's one of those, right? Like what might be going on there? I see this data, those numbers tell me something, but what's it telling me? There's a lot of different possibilities that could be happening there. As we talked about, it could be that you have, especially when you drill your data down to the program level, you could have one really low performing program that is doing exceptionally poorly on behalf of the people of color it's serving. That may be a resource issue, that may be a bad case management issue. There's lots of things that might be going on there, but you don't know what those are if you don't just at least start with that data and look at that measure, right? Next slide. And the thing that I was talking about there is also the context of the data and who do you need to be including in the data. For me, this one goes back to that beginning conversation on coordinated entry. Who are you reaching out to? Who knows about coordinated entry? Who knows how to get in touch with the homelessness system? If you see that you're not serving people of color at equitable rates, think about who is the community that you're serving. Who are you partnering with? Making sure that when you're doing data gathering itself, that you are incorporating the experiences of folks who have been homeless, that you're including people of color and other folks in other demographics in your community to expand what you mean by community so that you get a richer picture of the data about homelessness. This can include some really great ideas here from Alyssa Parrish and Mary Francis, who did these slides earlier, but like think about other resources in your community that are not homelessness specific, right, but that are culturally specific. So these include national organizations like Urban League, NAACP, Native American organizations, dedicated philanthropists who work with Black and Indigenous people of color organizations, also local folks that are faith-based groups that work in communities of color, social service organizations, all of those that may not be part of your traditional and official homelessness system, but that are serving underserved communities and that can help you connect with those folks that you might be missing, right? When you're doing your data gathering in all the official capacities like point in time count. We know in point in time count that we're missing a lot of folks, right? And again, just another way to connect with these folks is thinking about mailing lists, making sure that you have notices on their websites, co-hosting events and outreach events. This is all a way to think about data that's beyond just your traditional point in time count, your system performance measures, Stella, all of that kind of stuff. Next slide. And qualitative data, this is an important piece. I tend to be a more quantitative kind of person. I think that too often, and this can happen when we think about lived experience, where we maybe kind of fetishize a particular kind of story that we hear from people experiencing homelessness. We have to keep in mind that qualitative data can be one person's experience that may not be emblematic of most of people experiencing homelessness in our community, but it's important to have that to go along with the numbers to help tease out what might be going on. So the way that that they've put it here is that quantitative data can show you the inequity, right? Like it's showing you a bigger picture, but thinking about the why an inequity exists, some of that can be happening on a very individual level. And more important for me, it speaks about how to address it, right? I think where qualitative data is really, really important is for understanding what people actually need to end their homelessness, right? But even while you're doing the qualitative data analysis, you're also still doing a level of quantitative analysis, and that's demographic analysis, right? And this is the importance of when you're looking at qualitative data and listening to the experiences that folks have, thinking about them as more than just they're someone experiencing homelessness. They're also people of different races and ethnicities, different genders, folks that have disabilities, folks who have been in child welfare system, right? There's lots of different buckets, social categories that people fall into that can influence the experience of homelessness that they have and the experience of getting out of homelessness and what they need to get out of homelessness. So that part is also really important. Next slide. And again, this is just part of that whole, like, you're never going to have perfect data. So you always want to be open to making this an ongoing process, right? You're implementing programs, you're monitoring programs, you're reporting out, you're analyzing those reports, and then you're making the improvements, because we're never going to get to perfection. So there's always work to be done. It's really absolutely not a one-time thing. You need to build this into all of your data gathering, incorporating this lens and thinking about demographic data, and setting equity goals that are part of your funding processes, the contracting that you do. You want to see, especially at the program level, equitable outcomes, so that you can think about, like, what's going on in this program. Again, keeping in mind, one of the most consistent disparities that we see is actually in returns to homelessness. That has a lot of implications for how programs work, right? And how to improve programs. So making sure that you have the ability to monitor what's happening at the program level, working that into your contracts is really important. And also being able to be flexible and be willing to, if we see some new data coming up, being flexible enough to be able to make changes there. I think that's it for me. And now Chris is going to talk about some California specific data.
Thank you, Mindy. I'm going to start with the. Yes, thank you. I'm going to start with the bigger picture stuff and kind of work our way down. So ultimately, you know, one of the things we have access to is Stella P, and the P stands for performance. Stella does not stand for anything. It's just called Stella. So one of the very first places that we often tell folks to look for is what do you have in your Stella data? So you create your longitudinal statistical analysis, known as LSA. You submit that to HUD. They accept it after back and forth, and then you're able to Stellavize that data, i.e. put it into the performance metrics that HUD has set up. Now, there are limitations to those metrics. I want to be very clear. You can do a better or deeper analysis on your own data without using Stella, but this is also just something that you have kind of at your disposal without needing to go and do a bunch of other data analysis. So just a few qualifiers for Stella P. We don't talk about individuals, we talk about households. So that it can be something that you may not necessarily, want. Maybe you want to look at individuals and not households. We obviously in Stella have plenty of demographics. We look at some of our metrics like returns to homelessness, days experiencing homelessness, your total homeless experience, exits to permanent housing, which I'm going to talk about more specifically as it relates to California on the next slide. Returns to homelessness, pathways. Where are folks going? Are they mostly going through emergency shelter to get to permanent housing, or is it a different path? And then we have the race, ethnicity, and other aspects of identity analysis that we're really going to focus on. Next slide, please. So what we did is the state of California HCD, through their work with ESGCV round 2, I believe it was, their application process, and it was in, I believe, Appendix E and F, if you were someone who was lucky enough to fill that out in eCivis. In Appendix E and F, you were asked to provide data. Most everyone, I think everyone at the end, I think we had to find a few, submitted their Stella P data. And what we did with that is created a Tableau data visualization tool just for the state of California. And we have it here linked, which I will put in the chat in a moment, that you can actually look at what racial equity looked like in the Stella P data that you gave us. And I believe this came from 2018. So what we did see is that there was definitely disparities across COCs. There was not like every COC had the same different systems. It was different across the 44 COCs that do encompass the state of California. We did see some common trends, which I'll talk about a little bit. But again, you can, oops. Thanks, Robert. I meant to send that to everybody, and I sent it just to one person. There's that public Tableau that we created. So please feel free to click on that, and you can go through it and kind of listen to what I'm saying. So we got someone off mute. Does someone ask a question? Nope. Okay. Sorry about that. So a few common trends we did see across California. This is not necessarily going to be reflective of what it is like for you in your community, but it is what the state of California data looked like across the entirety of it. So we saw that Black and African American households were accessing permanent supportive housing and other services at a lesser rate than the overall percentage of Black and African American households experiencing homelessness. So we had more folks in that category that were homeless than were accessing permanent housing. They were also, if they made it to permanent housing, more likely to exit to another non-permanent housing destination. So think about that. What additional exits to permanent housing for our Black and African American households exiting to permanent housing? Why does that exist in our community? So you can look at this data, kind of see what it says, and then ask the question of your own community. Well, what are we doing that causes this, or how do we address this? Another overarching thing that you see in this particular slice of data is that white non-Hispanic households were accessing permanent supportive housing at a higher rate than found in households experiencing homelessness, while white Hispanic households were accessing permanent supportive housing at a much lower rate. So what does that ethnicity difference show us? What does that tell us about our community? That folks that self-identify as white, non-Hispanic are getting access to permanent housing at a much higher rate than those that are white but Hispanic. So think about how that data might affect you and how you plan homeless services in your community. The last slice of data I want to show today before we just open it up and have a conversation is on the next slide. And this is from HDIS. So our homeless data integration system, if someone can put that in the chat, the landing page that I have here, I'd appreciate it because I messed it up last time while talking. So HDIS is a data information system that all 44 COCs across California submit data to. And we're able to then do data analysis on race, equity, racial equity, and other things. But this is something that we certainly wanted to focus on today of HDIS's capability. HDIS, you can see that right here, I selected all of California. You can go in and select just your COC, and I selected 2019 because I knew that my Tableau data that you've already seen was from 2018. So this is a different set of data for a different time. So you look down here through race and ethnicity, and you'll see that the lightest blue is the percentage of general population across the state of California. The darker blue is percentage of people living at or below the poverty line of that racial or ethnic group. And the last is those experiencing homelessness. So in the Asian population, for instance, we have a lot more in the general population than we have at the poverty line or that are experiencing homelessness. But the exact opposite is happening for Black or African American families, where only 5% of the population, 8% of that at the poverty line, and 30% of those experiencing homelessness. So that's something we would want to investigate as a state. Why is that existing? Why does the data bear that out? So all this data is really, again, the starting point. What information do we have? Likely we don't have anything that's going to be completely comprehensive. So we might need to look at HDIS. We might need to look at that tableau that we've created just for the state of California. Look at your own HMIS data or other data sets that you have to really compile a more complete picture. And also remember that a lot of the providers that might be serving Black, Indigenous, or people of color might not be using HMIS, which means they're not part of this at all. That is a definite known blind spot for our data set. Esteban, I will send you what the poverty level threshold is. If you go to the HDIS website and scroll down to this piece, there are about 10 disclaimers on this particular set of data that are going to tell you that, but I don't have it memorized. It was way too many nuances for me to commit to memory, but I'll happily look at that in a second and kind of give you some ideas. Okay, next slide, please. All right, we've got to the fun part. So I started to answer Esteban's question. I'm going to continue to answer Esteban's question. Mindy, do you have anything to add based on anything that I've said thus far, or what you've seen in the chat?
No, there's just what's a really cool thing though is there's lots of resources for you guys to gather data. Recognizing that none of it's perfect, but like the more ways that you have to gather data, the more data you have, the more you can kind of see where you're missing stuff. I'll put a couple of more things. This is the Alliance did quite a while back now, but it's still relevant. A toolkit that they put together, it's a simple spreadsheet, right? Like this is where you have to start somewhere. There's lots of rich resources for data, but there's also like a really simple way to start, and that's just with a spreadsheet. And it's looking at who's coming into your system, who's getting into which programs, who's leaving your system, who's returning to homelessness, right? Like those are some very simple ways to get started. And then in addition to Stella, HUD also has its own race and ethnicity analysis tool, right? Like, so there's a lot of data out there. What I would love to have a conversation with you all about, whatever you guys want to talk about, but I really love the discussions that kind of ask those questions. So I put in the chat, right? Like, what's going on there? We can be really quick to assume, like jump to this is a bad thing. Maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe Black folks are connecting with friends and family at higher rates than white folks. We don't know, right? Like, and one of the ways that you get to that is to do some focus groups, do some qualitative interviews, find out what's happening with folks. And it's probably not just one thing. Again, thinking back to that coordinated entry analysis, right? Like if you see that you have folks who are returning to homelessness at disparate rates, what's going on there? It could be the level of the case manager. It could be that you're, if you look at your data, you're not providing enough rental assistance for Black families. It could be that there's, we know this happens, there's landlord discrimination, right? Like all of those things could be and probably are happening, but each of those things requires a different response to address it. And to me, this is the really fun part about doing these kinds of analyses is like being able to, it's not as simple as like this bad, this good, right? Like there's just much more thoughtfulness that has to go into it. So happy to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, but I think for me, those are the most productive kinds of conversations is to say, we see this, what might be happening there and what might be the solution.
So I have one question, but before I do, I'm going to answer Esteban's question specifically. So Esteban, if you go to the HDIS website and go down to the racial equity piece that I was highlighting there, there's a thing that says data dictionary. And in there, it describes what people living below poverty means. And this is, here's the definition of it. I'll just read it aloud, but you're welcome to go there yourself. Individuals living below the poverty threshold as determined by the American Community Survey, ACS. According to the ACS, the total number of people below the poverty level is the sum of people in families and the number of unrelated individuals with income in the last 12 months below the poverty threshold. So we know ACS is not necessarily the most accurate, but it's what we have to go on. So that is how that particular data set was built. Mindy, the question I'm going to send your way, I need to find it again, so give me 1 second because I lost it in my thread over here. So when we talk about looking at our HMIS and kind of understand if our data, trying to understand equity in our data system, what should that look like? We know that the point in time count isn't particularly useful. We know that some other data sets aren't particularly useful. So what is the thing that we should strive for? And I myself know that answer varies from community to community, but I just wondered what your thoughts were.
I will push back and say I don't think the point in time count is useless. I think it can be better. Everything can be better. I think having a way to figure out who is unsheltered is really, really important. There are ways to improve that, but I wouldn't want us to stop doing that. There are especially ways to improve point in time count to find and connect to more unsheltered folks of color. And that's where one of the pieces that we talked about here about improving data and connecting to social service organizations that serve people of color that may not necessarily be part of your official homelessness system. That's a really important piece of that puzzle. The other thing about point in time count and any data that you have is having that a place to start and to measure against over and over and over, year to year to year. So that's how I feel about point in time count.
Yeah. I don't think that was the exact question I asked, but yes, I will.
So tell me now. I got distracted on my point in time count soapbox. So give me the rest of the question again.
And I will admit my prejudice for point in time is it's not necessarily something that I put a lot of faith in because it's just one night. And I like to look at longitudinal data that gives me a much deeper picture. So it really is that question. How do we really assemble a set of data, or what data sets do we look at, knowing that HMIS in and of itself isn't going to show us all of our equities or inequities?
Yeah. So I think what we've talked about already, you have point in time count. You have your HMIS annualized data and you ask about each of those. What is this telling me and what is this missing, right? So with point in time count, obviously we're missing a lot and there are ways to improve that. Some of the confusion about the definition of homelessness comes in on point in time count, right? Like it's the difference between eligibility. A lot of people are defined as purposes for different kinds of eligibility, but only category 1 people are counted on point in time count night. So when you're thinking about who you're missing people in category 4 on that night. You're missing people in category 2. You're missing people in category 3. There's no way to capture those folks in a single night without going door to door and saying, hi, is there someone living here who is a victim of domestic violence and can't leave yet, which you're clearly not going to do. Or hi, is there someone living on your couch who has to leave in 2 weeks or less, or 2 weeks or more? So having that annualized data to balance that out is really important. But then you ask what's missing in the annualized data, right? Like those are folks who touch the homelessness system. How do you get a better idea about who you could reach that might be experiencing homelessness or housing instability, but aren't touching the homelessness system? And that's where I think this is where part of this data question and equity question has to be a larger coordinated community question. There's data out there in all of these, especially where prevention is concerned, quote unquote, feeder systems, right? Is your child welfare system tracking housing outcomes? Is your public health system asking housing and homelessness stability questions? Is your criminal justice system asking those questions, right? Like all of those school systems, right? Like we have school system data, that data is also problematic for a lot of reasons, but as many places that you can pull data from, that you can get data sharing agreements, that you can navigate all of that privacy and release of information, all of that all gives you a better picture of what's going on in your community. Veronica, yeah, expansion of street outreach, much better picture of unsheltered. And again, working it back to even when you're asking that question. So I know I want to get a better good idea of street out of unsheltered data. Who's unsheltered in my community? We expand street outreach, but also we're asking the question, where are we doing street outreach? I think I probably told you guys, because I use this as an example all the time. There's a large city with a very large homelessness population that had a drop-in center for young people in the middle of the city. And if you just looked at the data of who was going to that drop-in center, it was a very, very white group, right? And when somebody finally got the great idea to let's go talk to some folks that are kind of out in the suburbs and communities of color and see if they have homeless youth. Holy crap, they did have homeless youth. They weren't coming to the drop-in center because they couldn't get to the drop-in center, first of all, right? Like the public transit wasn't great. So there were homeless youth there, but the outreach wasn't happening to the youth of color community that was experiencing homelessness. So that the point about street outreach is awesome, Veronica. And then also you have to say, where am I doing the street outreach? Am I connecting to communities of color where people of color are experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness particularly?
Yeah, I was also going to respond to Veronica. I think they're making sure that we have sufficient street outreach, but we also have a lot of rural places within California, including where this conversation came from. Veronica's from Mendocino County. There's a lot of rural places, and it's hard to get an accurate, or complete coverage of street outreach across those places. But one other thing that we're working on, and this also rings true for Mendocino County, Humboldt County, I think Kings Tulare and LA, we are doing some funding for tribal nations through ESGCB, which is going to allow us to begin building relationships with tribal nations. And I know, at least in Mendocino County, that the biggest disparity that we see in the data in Mendocino County is Native American, Native Alaskan folks accessing the services. So beginning to build those bridges now through that funding and continuing those relationships after ESGC funding ends is a really good way to get more information in. I know the COC NOFO also mentions that tribes are now eligible to become COCs or to join COC areas, which will also help begin building those paths. We're really on the beginning of this conversation of building our relationships with tribal nations that will help us extend racial equity into that space, not just the Black African-American space and other Hispanic spaces that we are trying to make way with, but it's a little bit different working with tribal nations as sovereign entities that don't necessarily trust the government or trust what a COC might be. So it is a great opportunity for us to increase our data around racial equity by making those connections to tribal nations, and having 8 funded now across California for ESGCB is a really good starting point. But we need to get deeper so we have enough data that can actually show us what is happening to those populations as well.
I love thinking about this. Is part of this thinking about this, right? Like the rural context, especially. One of the great ideas that I heard from one of the rural, it's hard to call it a community because it's the whole balance of state, right? One of the ways that they do outreach for rural folks experiencing homelessness is actually convenience stores, right? Where, in small rural communities that don't even have stoplights, like the place where I grew up, even in those places, the one place that everybody goes to is the convenience store, because it functions as the grocery store and the kind of general store, and there's bulletin boards, and people come in and have coffee and chit chat. And those cashiers in that convenience store see everybody in the community and kind of know everything that's going on there. So that's another way of like just the kind of thinking that you do about how do I reach the people that I'm not reaching, and that's one of the really great ideas.
Yeah. So I see another comment from Veronica. Veronica, you want to talk a little bit about what's happening? I'm assuming this is Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority, which covers, I believe, 7 or 8 tribes itself. Do you want to talk about the conversations you're having with them?
Yeah, sure. I've been in communication a lot with the Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority's Executive Director, Elizabeth Elliott, and their Program Manager, Mariah McGill. They applied for and were awarded ESG CV funds for I believe 3 of our local tribes here, and we have 2 more that were awarded on their own as individual tribes. So not only will we be working back with Northern Circle, we're also going to be working with Sherwood Valley Band of Pomo Indians and the Manchester Band of Pomo Indians as well. So it's more than just working with one entity that can represent all of them. We need to work with each one individually as their own entity, as their own jurisdiction, with their own priorities and their own objectives. So, and as the COC coordinator for the jurisdiction that includes a lot of those tribal nations, we as a community need to improve how we're doing our work. Our strategic planning committee is working on revising our governing board, our COC's governing board, board seats. We know at least one addition or update that's guaranteed to happen is the inclusion of a tribal government or tribal nation representative. And we need that additional representation. Not only are they in our communities, now they're going to be providing similar services in our community, and we need to coordinate. We don't want to, start doing street outreach in an area they're already planning to outreach at, and so we need to do a lot of coordination in who and how are they serving folks, so that we can, not only make sure there's not a duplication of benefit, but also make sure that those who are in need are connected. We have a lot of folks, Native Americans, in our county that are disconnected from services. They don't know where to go. There's a lot of cultural stigma around accessing mainstream resources. So this is a huge opportunity for us to really change our delivery system to encompass the needs of our folks. Instead of what does the system need, we're looking at what do the folks in our community need and how can we adapt our system to meet those.
Thanks, Veronica. Appreciate that. I am very excited about this particular piece of work in California and nationally that we are beginning to engage tribal nations. I know we're going to have a brown bag later on in this year about tribal nation engagement. We're also going to be doing a series of community workshops on tribal nation engagement that everyone here is going to be welcome to join. We haven't scheduled it yet, but it'll be later this year to just reinforce that message from California HDIS, from us, that we really want to see tribal nations thought of and at the table and having a spot and being part of the process moving forward. So I'm glad to hear where folks are going in Mendocino County. Thanks, Veronica. Any other questions? Anyone want to come off mute and talk to Mindy and I about racial equity and data? Or we can end a little bit early maybe today. Unless, Mindy, you have anything while we're waiting for folks to join. All right, I am not hearing anything, and I think 10 minutes back in one's day is a great thing. So we will go ahead and say thank you, Mindy Mitchell, for helping us with this conversation on racial equity and data today. Thank you all for joining us and being here for this conversation. If there are no further questions, we will go ahead and end today's session. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, everybody.